Hi, my name is Anna Swanson. I'm the trade reporter for the New York Times, and today I'm going to be speaking with you live about an escalating trade conflict between the United States and China, in which the Trump administration today announced that it's moving forward with about $50 billion, tariffs on about $50 billion of products imported from China. So I'll be answering your questions about the tariffs, the effect on the economy, and anything else you're wondering about. Go ahead and put your questions in the comment section for me, and I'll be addressing them very shortly here. First, just to give you an introduction to the conflict. So the United States and China have been wrapped in kind of an escalating trade conflict over what the United States says are unfair trade practices. And today, the Trump administration announced that it would move ahead with tariffs on about $50 billion of products that we import from China every year. And that has really ramped up tensions between the two countries because China is now vowing to retaliate. So basically, those tariffs are broken up into two groups. The first is tariffs on about $34 billion of products, which will go into effect on July 6th. And then there's an additional $16 billion that the administration is going to hold hearings for and give companies the chance to give input on. And then this morning, China said that it would respond with its own tariffs. It didn't specify exactly what U.S. goods would be targeted, but we do know that they have talked in the past about targeting agricultural products and manufactured goods. So one interesting thing about this conflict is that White House trade advisors have been pretty divided over how to proceed. Some have been more concerned about the economic consequences of a trade war, while others think that the United States needs to take this more hardline stance and really crack down on China because they say that China has been committing sort of unfair trade practices for many, many years. So this move today, we are interpreting as somewhat of a victory by this more hardline faction inside the White House. It's also going to put at risk some concessions that China has offered to the United States. It recently said that it would purchase about $70 billion of U.S. products, but it would take that offer off the table if tariffs went into effect. So conceivably, that offer will be off the table and China will move ahead with retaliation. So in recent weeks, the president has also sought China's help on arranging the summit with North Korea. That's been a really important part of the relationship as well. So the 25% tariffs altogether fall on about 1,000 different categories of Chinese goods. It includes a lot of industrial machinery, also things like nuclear reactors, aircraft engine parts, bulldozers, tractors. And the list generally focuses on industrial sectors that relate to an industrial plan that China has called Made in China 2025, the administration says. And so this is a plan that China has for developing high-tech industries that are expected to dominate the future. So that includes things like aerospace, automobiles, industrial machinery, information technology, and robotics. I'll be taking your questions in just a minute here, so if you have a question, please go ahead and put it in the comment section and we'll get it answered for you. So the White House has said that these measures are necessary to kind of reset the trade relationship with China. They say that China has been violating international trade rules for many years and that the approach of past administrations hasn't worked. And so it's necessary to take tough steps like tariffs in order to get the country to change its behavior. But there are also a lot of critics of the measure, including many businesses, investors, economists, consumer groups. So economists argue that tariffs are a tax and that they essentially drive up prices both for American consumers who are buying Chinese products at stores like Target and Walmart, and also businesses which buy both inputs to make things from China and then also look to China as a market for their own products. So there are some concerns that this will potentially have a dampening effect on economic growth that's otherwise been boosted by the administration's tax cut. Although economists argue about just how big that effect is, some saying it won't have a very large effect, others saying that we could see tens of thousands of jobs lost due to it. All right, I think that's about it for a summary of what's going on right now. Let's go ahead and open this up to take some of your questions. Again, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the comments section and I will address them here for you. So Stephanie Ledoux asks, when will this take effect? So the tariffs are basically broken up into two different groups. The administration had previously announced $50 billion of tariffs, but they wanted to give companies a chance to comment on those and either complain or protest or say that they wanted their own additional tariff. So they did that and they whittled the list down to $34 billion of products. That's the finalized list. And so that will go into effect on July 6th. However, to get to that original 50 billion number that the president promised, they did introduce a new list of about $16 billion in products, and we don't know when exactly those will go into effect. The administration wants to hold hearings on those and give businesses a chance to weigh in. All right. Elias Lopez Gross asks, how will this affect U.S. consumers and users of Chinese raw materials? So it is a 25% tariff on about 1,000 different products imported from China. And so the immediate effect is, that the price of those goods as they come into the country will increase by 25%, which is kind of substantial. Of course, we don't know if that cost, will be passed on directly to consumers, or maybe the companies that are importing it will end up eating part of the cost. So Walmart, for example, might import something and choose to increase the price by just about 10% and maybe eat the rest as a loss. But somebody has to pay the tariff. So in the end, it'll be the consumer. It might be the Chinese company getting a lower price for their good, or it might be a U.S. business that is then selling that good onto another person or store. Again, I'm Anna Swanson. I'm the trade reporter for the New York Times. I'm here answering your questions about this escalating trade conflict between the United States and China. If you have questions, please put them in the comment section, and I'm addressing them here for you. Thanks. Philip John Kleiser asks, I'm curious if this has happened in the past, and if so, what happened and what were the subsequent consequences? This is an interesting case because there are parallels with past examples, but nothing, I think, exactly similar has happened in the past. The current moment is pretty unique because the Trump administration has launched not just kind of one trade conflict, but is actually looking at multiple trade conflicts, placing tariffs on steel and aluminum from countries around the world, as well as renegotiating NAFTA, and then also in this rather large trade fight with China. But there are some parallels. So one past example are the tariffs that the Obama administration put on tires. Well, that was something that happened in 2009. And there was one study by the Peterson Institute, which is a respected Economics Institute here in Washington, D.C., that found that this did actually save some jobs, but that the cost of each of these jobs saved was just absolutely exorbitant. So I'm checking here. I can follow up in the comments section, but I think it was, you know, thousands of dollars, if not $1 million in for each job saved. So there are some past studies that show that tariffs can protect U.S. industry, but the point that economists make is that this comes at an extremely high price for consumers and for others, and there may be more direct ways to kind of subsidize industry. Hugo Farias asks, can China retaliate with something other than tariffs? After all, they own a large amount of U.S. bonds and in general U.S. debt. So I do think there are some different ways that China could retaliate beyond tariffs. It's true that China has very large holdings of U.S. debt. And I have seen some people speculate that China could do a little bit to sell off that debt around the margins. The problem with that is that it actually can't sell too many of those holdings without influencing the value of its own currency. And so it probably isn't in China's interest to sell off too much American debt. And so probably, you know, that's something that would happen around the margins. It's somewhat restrained in that regard. However, there are other things that the country can do. And one thing that U.S. businesses worry a lot about is other measures, other types of retaliation that don't have to do with tariffs. And those could be unofficial actions taken on U.S. companies, for example, slowing down approvals. Maybe a U.S. business is shipping fruit or cherries into China, and those cherries are held up at the ports for so long that they just rot on the docks. Things like that have happened before. Foreign companies investigated for anti-monopoly violations. So businesses are very worried about that type of retaliation. And the Trump administration did say today that if they see that kind of retaliation, they will go ahead with more tariffs on China as well. Christina Rivera Rasmussen asks, where can we find a list of these items that have the additional tariff? I can go ahead and put them a link here in Facebook for you. It's also on my Twitter feed. I tweeted it out this morning. I'm at Anna Swanson, ANASWANSON. You can find that there. And it's kind of a boring and technical list, but it does, as I said, include a lot of industrial products, agricultural machinery, airplane parts, things like that. Again, I'm Anna Swanson. I'm the trade reporter for the New York Times. I'm here answering your questions about this escalating trade conflict between the United States and China. The Trump administration announced today that it's moving forward with tariffs on $50 billion of Chinese products. And I'm talking today about the implications of this for U.S. consumers and businesses. If you have a question, go ahead and post it in the comments section now, and I'll go ahead and address some of those. So I have a question here from Sam Brennan. Is the United States going to be sidelined on the global economic trade stage by other countries allying themselves with each other? So this is a really interesting question. The Trump administration has said that their America First doctrine does not mean America alone. So they've emphasized that the country is still going to be working in partnership with other countries. But obviously the trade tensions have really escalated in the last few weeks as we've seen the Trump administration place tariffs not just on China, but on close allies like Canada and Mexico and the European Union. And the meeting of the the group of 7 advanced countries that happened last weekend. There was some conversation of the G6 versus the G1, meaning that the other 6 countries were very united against the United States. So, I mean, the administration has said that America first does not mean America alone, but at least in recent weeks, we have seen many allies and adversaries kind of band together to oppose the United States, both in their statements, in cases at the World Trade Organization. So experts that I've spoken with do think there is some cause for concern about the state of America's alliances. Diana Spencer asks, is there any good side benefit to the tariffs? Yeah, that's a good question. So I do think that, there are industries that do strongly support the tariffs. There was a hearing here in Washington in mid-May in which companies got to weigh in about the tariffs, and there were some that came to speak in support of them. There were also many who argued that they wanted tariffs on their product category, that the administration had not proposed tariffs and they wanted those tariffs on their product category. And that's basically because they felt that they were facing very stiff competition from abroad, and in many cases arguing that competition was unfair. So in that situation, I think economists would say that every business would like to be protected from competition. Maybe for some businesses there is unfair competition. For example, China subsidizes certain industries, has created overcapacity in other industries, and so that is unfairly driving American companies out of business. But in other cases, it's just companies taking advantage of the situation to protect themselves from competition. And economists worry that this can lead to a state where the U.S. economy is less productive and less innovative. So there's that. I mean, some businesses do gain protection from unfair competition. It also raises prices for those businesses domestically. Could theoretically allow them to invest more in their workforce, and could allow some emerging industries to develop and keep China from dominating some industries of the future. For example, this is known as the infant industry argument. Of course, there are a lot of arguments on the other side as well. Tom Cummings asks, with no positive trade agreements and a trade war, will we see a recession soon? So I do think that most economists right now believe that the economic impact of what has been proposed is pretty modest. That's because we're just seeing tariffs on a small proportion of goods that the United States imports. And actually, the U.S. economy is pretty insulated from trade. So trade only makes up about 12% of our GDP, I believe. And so compared with a lot of other countries, the United States is actually less hit by tariffs because we do have a big domestic market. And that said, there probably is going to be some kind of negative impact. Maybe taking away sort of a fraction of the benefits of the tax cut. So yes, I do expect there to be somewhat of a negative impact. I saw estimates today from the Tax Foundation, which is a conservative organization. They estimate that nearly 50,000 jobs, I think, will be lost as a result of the tariffs. So again, not huge numbers, but again, for people in those industries, for people with those jobs, that is somewhat painful. Great. All right. Well, I think that's been about all of your questions. Thank you so much for joining us today. And you can go to the New York Times to read more about our coverage of this escalating trade conflict between the United States and China. Thanks.